When I saw him standing in the hallway, holding the towel I had forgotten to take into the bathroom, something inside me twisted, not from guilt, but from something far more complicated. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be fixing the shelves in the garage, not bringing me soft cotton and unexpected presents. My ankle throbbed from the stupid fall in the garden an hour earlier, but it was nothing compared to the way my thoughts pulsed now. His eyes met mine for just a second too long. There was no smile, no intention, but I felt it, a subtle shift in the air between us. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the vulnerability of being half-wrapped in a towel with my hair wet and my mind spiraling. I reached for the towel quickly, mumbled a thank you, but as I did, our fingers brushed. A pause. A silence. A slow inhale that wasn't mine. My throat closed, not with fear, but with recognition. Not of him, but of something in myself. Something I hadn't allowed to exist for a long time. I closed the door with shaking fingers and leaned back against it, breathing hard. What was that? A gesture? A glance? A threat? No. None of those. It was a crack. And once there's a crack, things begin to seep through. Things you thought were long buried. Let me tell you how it started. How something so small, so seemingly innocent, became the one thing I could never take back. Before I share the moment that changed everything, tell me, have you ever crossed a line you didn't see coming until it was already far behind you? The morning he left, the house fell into a quiet that I had once craved, and now couldn't quite sit with. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, watching the car disappear down the road, and even after the silence settled, I remained still. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't relief. It was an emptiness I didn't know how to name. He had kissed my cheek like always, just slightly off target, as if even that routine gesture no longer required accuracy. No real hug. Just a hand on my arm, and a list of last-minute instructions about the bills and the groceries and which neighbor to call in case of anything. I nodded, smiled, and nodded again. I had played this role so long that I didn't need a script anymore. The plan was simple: he'd be gone for several days. A work trip. A seminar. Something about construction permits in another province. I didn't really listen. I just knew the days would stretch, quiet and uneventful, and that somehow didn't bother me like it used to. I had learned to live inside the hush. Later that morning, I hobbled into the garden with my pruning shears, determined to make something productive of the stillness. The lavender bush had gone wild, and the roses needed attention. It was when I leaned over too quickly, trying to catch a low-hanging branch, that my foot slipped on the damp stone. I fell hard. My ankle twisted in a sharp, burning way that made me curse aloud. I lay there, stunned, staring up at the pale blue sky and thinking how absurd it was to injure yourself doing something so gentle. For a moment, I thought I might have to crawl back inside. And then his voice broke the silence. "You okay?" I lifted my head and saw him, my husband's nephew, standing at the gate, carrying a bag of tools and a set of gloves. He had arrived just the day before to help around the property. His visits were infrequent, mostly during summer breaks or holidays. He was in his 20s now, taller than I remembered, stronger too. I hadn't expected him until later that day, but there he was. I tried to wave him off. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile that hurt more than my ankle. "You're clearly not." He walked toward me, fast but careful, crouching down beside me. "Can you move your foot?" I couldn't. Not without sharp pain shooting up my leg. "Okay, don't try again. Let me help." And before I could argue, he'd slipped one arm beneath my shoulders and another beneath my knees and lifted me as if I weighed nothing. I hadn't been carried like that in years. Not even by my husband. I was too startled to protest, and too aware of the heat in my face as he carried me into the house. He settled me onto the living room couch with surprising gentleness, his brow furrowed, his hands steady. "I'll get ice," he said, already moving toward the kitchen. I watched him go, thinking about how quickly he had taken control, how natural it seemed to him. When he returned, he knelt in front of me again, placing the ice pack gently on my ankle. I hissed at the cold and then laughed, nervous, shaky, too loud. "Thanks," I said. "I'm just embarrassed." "Don't be," he said, meeting my eyes. "Happens to everyone." But it wasn't the words. It was the way he looked at me. Not with pity. Not with indifference. But as if I was real. Fully seen. He left after that, saying he'd get started on the shelves in the garage and check on me later. The door closed behind him, and I sat very still, the ice cold against my skin, my thoughts hot and swirling. What just happened? It had been nothing. A simple gesture. A helpful young man assisting a woman who'd had a silly accident. But it had been something, too. Something I couldn't quite explain or ignore. There had been a moment. A blink. A glance. A spark. I told myself not to overthink. Not to assign meaning where there was none. But part of me, some reckless, quiet part, didn't want to let it go. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. The house creaked and shifted, the way old houses do, but I heard him moving below. A door. Footsteps. The sound of a drill. I pictured him in the garage, sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow, fixing what my husband had always said he'd get to and never did. I realized then how long it had been since I had watched someone move with purpose. How long since anyone in this house moved towards something, rather than around it. I closed my eyes and felt the pressure of his arms lifting me earlier. I told myself to sleep. To stop this before it turned into something. But I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes when he said, "Don't be embarrassed." Not because he pitied me. Because, in that moment, I don't think he saw me as weak. I think he saw me as a woman. And I realized, with a quiet and aching certainty, that I hadn't felt like one in a very long time. The next morning, the house felt heavier than usual. The kind of weight that sits in the corners of each room and doesn't move when you open the windows. I tried to pretend that nothing had changed. That yesterday was just a moment, fleeting, misread, unimportant. But my body betrayed me. Every step on my still tender ankle sent reminders up my spine, as if my own muscles were whispering, "You remember." I spent the morning doing nothing. Not resting, not really. Just moving things from one place to another, folding already folded laundry, reheating tea that I never drank. I didn't want to look out the window. I didn't want to see if he was still in the garage or somewhere else on the property. And I certainly didn't want to wonder if he was thinking about what happened. What did happen? That question followed me like a shadow. Our fingers brushed, our eyes held, and the silence between us had spoken louder than any sentence I could recall in months. It was nothing. And yet it was everything. When I finally made my way to the kitchen for something more than tea, I found a small note resting against the sugar bowl. Asterisk went into town for supplies. Will be back around lunch. Asterisk. No signature. Just that neat, tidy handwriting that somehow looked older than his years. I stared at the note longer than I should have, my hand resting on the countertop, the tiles cool beneath my fingers. He hadn't mentioned yesterday. Not directly. But he also hadn't disappeared. He was still here. Still within reach. I don't know why, but I went upstairs to shower, even though I had no plans to go anywhere. It took effort to undress, not because of pain, but because of hesitation. I looked at myself in the mirror, searching for something, an answer, a warning, a line I could draw and promise not to cross. I didn't find one. My reflection looked the same, a woman shaped by years of compromise, of roles played too well and too long. A woman who had been loved, perhaps, but not touched, not really, for longer than she wanted to admit. The water was too hot, and the steam filled the room quickly. I let it happen, as if I needed to be blurred. As if I could hide even from myself. But even with my eyes closed, I kept seeing him, crouched beside me in the garden, arms beneath me, steady voice telling me not to move. And I hated how comforting that memory was. By the time he returned, I had already prepared lunch. A simple salad, some grilled chicken, nothing special, but I had set the table on the back porch. I told myself it was for the fresh air. For the view. For the change of routine. But I knew better. He approached quietly, carrying bags from the hardware store. When he saw the table, he paused just briefly, before giving me that small, almost shy smile of his. "You didn't have to do all this," he said as he set the bags down by the door. I shrugged. Thought we could both use a break. We ate mostly in silence, save for the occasional comment about the weather or the neighbor's overly ambitious gardening. I noticed he avoided eye contact, but not in a guilty way, more like someone walking a narrow ledge, careful not to look down. After we finished, I gathered the plates, limping slightly on my way to the sink. I heard him move behind me, then stop. I didn't turn around. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. "A bit," I replied, rinsing a fork too long. "Do you want help with the bandage again?" There was a beat. A small one. But I heard something in his tone. Not suggestion. Not pressure. Just a question, asked plainly, respectfully. "No, I've got it," I said softly. He nodded, or I think he did. I still hadn't turned around. I was afraid that if I looked at him, I'd say something I couldn't take back. He stayed a while longer, organizing the tools in the garage, checking the door hinges, pretending everything was normal. I stayed in the living room, pretending the same. But every noise he made reached me. Every thud of wood, every creak of metal. It felt like he was inside the walls. That evening, the house was too quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the absence of my husband that I noticed, it was the presence of something else. Something new. Something waiting. I couldn't sleep. I moved from room to room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, rereading old cookbooks, sitting on the edge of the couch with a blanket around my shoulders. It was just after midnight when I finally went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The light from the fridge illuminated the room in a pale blue hue, casting long shadows behind me. I didn't hear him approach. I turned, startled, and there he was, standing in the doorway, hair tousled, shirt wrinkled. We both froze. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "Didn't mean to scare you." I shook my head. "No, it's fine." I couldn't sleep. Me neither. We stood there, two people who should have nothing between them, and yet had everything. "I'll head back," he said after a moment, gesturing vaguely toward the guest room. "Okay," I replied, but didn't move. Neither did he. The silence stretched. Then, without a word, he stepped closer, not too close, just enough to feel the space shift again. Just enough for me to notice that I was holding my breath. I wanted to say something. To make it light, to laugh, to do anything other than stand there with my heart in my throat. But all I could do was look at him. And then, we kissed. It lasted a second, maybe two. A mistake. A miracle. A moment. When it ended, we both stood there, stunned. He stepped back. I let him. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He left the room first. I stayed, fingers trembling around the glass I hadn't touched. The fridge hummed behind me. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. I leaned against the counter, closed my eyes, and whispered into the dark, "What have I done?" But I already knew. I woke up later than usual, sunlight already filtering through the curtains in narrow lines that striped the hardwood floor. For a moment, I forgot where I was, or rather, I forgot who I had become. My ankle ached as I shifted my leg off the bed, but that pain felt oddly distant, like something happening to someone else. I made my way downstairs slowly, more from caution than actual discomfort. The house felt normal again. That sterile, predictable kind of normal I used to find comfort in. Now, it just felt like a cover story. He was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't kissed him in the dark just hours ago. Like I hadn't stood frozen in my own kitchen with a thundering heart and the taste of consequence on my lips. He looked up when I entered, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. But there was no confrontation in his face, no tension. Just calm. He handed me a mug without a word, and I took it, nodding slightly. Our hands didn't touch this time. We sat across from each other, the wooden table between us an invisible wall. I stared at the rim of my cup, steam rising slowly. I couldn't bring myself to look up. Not yet. He said something about the hinges on the laundry door needing fixing, and I responded with a sound, maybe a aha, maybe nothing at all. How do you go back to being nothing, when you've already been something? After breakfast, he returned to the garage. I remained in the kitchen, wiping down already clean counters, rearranging a fruit bowl, staring too long at a speck on the window. Every movement was deliberate, designed to fill time I didn't want to have. I should have felt ashamed. Maybe I did. But more than anything, I felt exposed. Not because of what we had done, but because of what it had shown me about myself. That I wasn't numb, after all. That I was still capable of feeling things, unexpected, inconvenient, dangerous things. Around midday, I went outside for the first time since the fall. The garden was still slightly damp, the stone path shaded by the lemon tree. I didn't go far, just far enough to feel something other than air-conditioned air on my skin. I stood beneath the branches, watching a bee hover near a flower I hadn't even noticed blooming. It struck me then, how much of my life I had lived indoors. Not just physically, but emotionally. Always contained. Always proper. Always measured. When I turned back toward the house, I saw him through the garage window. He was sanding something, sleeves rolled up, his body moving in a rhythm that had nothing to do with me. And yet I couldn't stop watching. Not because I wanted something from him, but because he reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, what it looked like when someone moved with purpose. In the afternoon, I busied myself with laundry. It felt safe. Familiar. Mechanical. I folded shirts I didn't wear anymore and matched socks I hadn't seen in weeks. Somewhere in the middle of that rhythm, I heard footsteps behind me. I tightened the hinges, he said quietly from the doorway. Thank you, I replied without turning. There was a pause. I'll head into town again tomorrow. Some of the tools are giving out. I nodded. Another pause. You want anything? I shook my head. No. I'm fine. He waited a second longer, then walked away. I listened to the fading sound of his steps until they disappeared into the back hallway. That evening, I cooked dinner. Nothing special. Just pasta with olive oil, garlic, and a bit of lemon. It was the kind of meal that didn't require attention, which made it easier to get lost in my thoughts. He joined me at the table without hesitation, and for a while, we both pretended it was any other night. Halfway through the meal, I caught his eyes for the first time that day. He looked down quickly, but the flicker had been enough. I couldn't read what was behind it: regret, confusion, restraint. Maybe all three. After dinner, I cleared the table while he rinsed the plates. We moved around each other carefully, like dancers on a stage where the choreography was unfinished. When he reached across me to grab the dish towel, his arm brushed mine. It was nothing. It was everything. Later, I sat on the couch with a book I didn't open. The television murmured in the background, some old film that failed to hold my attention. He passed behind me once, then again, as if unsure what he was doing or where he was going. I didn't ask. Eventually, I turned off the TV and went upstairs. I didn't lock the door. Not because I expected anything, but because I didn't want to act out of fear. I changed into my nightgown, brushed my teeth, and lay down in the stillness. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. The silence wasn't oppressive, just patient. Like it was waiting for me to say something, to make sense of what had happened. But I had no answers. Only questions. Was I lonely? Maybe. Was I starved for touch? Possibly. Was I seeking something dangerous just to feel alive again? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had crossed into a version of myself I hadn't met before, and there was no map back. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock on the doorframe. I didn't move, didn't speak. He didn't enter. The knock was his way of saying good night, or maybe asking a question. I let the silence be my answer. Eventually, I heard him walk away. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay there with the weight of everything that hadn't been said pressing down on my chest. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure what kind of woman I had become. The morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated before climbing into the sky. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the patterns of light shifting across the ceiling. The ache in my ankle was still there, dull and manageable, but my mind was far louder than my body. Every thought seemed to return to that kiss, circling it like vultures over something still warm. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. I couldn't even pretend I wanted to forget it. And that truth lingered bitterly in my chest, like a confession whispered too close to your own ear. Eventually, I forced myself up. The hallway was quiet, and I moved through it as if walking on glass. Downstairs, I heard the faint sound of drawers opening and closing, the clink of ceramic against ceramic. He was in the kitchen. I paused on the stairs for longer than I should have. There was no point in hiding, but I still felt the impulse to delay. When I finally entered the room, he looked up with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His movements were slower than usual, more careful. The distance between us was filled with something we didn't have a name for yet. "Morning," I said, voice dry from disuse. He nodded and gestured toward the table. "Made coffee. Hope that's okay." I sat, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. The silence was dense. Comfortable wasn't the word for it, but it wasn't hostile either. It was just charged. Like the air before a storm. The day passed in fragments. He worked outside most of the time, sanding and sealing the wooden fence along the side yard. I stayed indoors, cleaning things that didn't need to be cleaned, checking emails I never intended to answer, walking in small circles from room to room. Once, I caught a glimpse of him through the back window, shirt off, sweat on his skin, bent over a plank of wood. I looked away too quickly, spilling a bit of tea on the countertop. By mid-afternoon, clouds began to gather. A gray layer settled over the house, muting everything, drawing the horizon inward. It felt like the world itself was exhaling, waiting. He came in not long after, wiping his hands on a towel, leaving faint streaks of dust on the edge of the sink. I was sitting at the kitchen table again, flipping through an old magazine, not reading a word of it. "Storm coming," he said simply. I nodded. "I can feel it." He poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter. We didn't speak for a while. The sound of the ticking clock filled the space. "I was going to fix the cabinet door upstairs," he said eventually. "Might be too humid now." "Tomorrow," I said. "It can wait." Another pause. "You sure?" I looked at him then. Really looked. There was something guarded in his face, an alertness I hadn't noticed before. Like he was waiting for my cue. "I'm sure." After he left the room, I exhaled slowly. Everything felt fragile, like one misplaced sentence could cause it all to collapse. And yet, it wasn't just tension I felt. It was awareness. Of myself, of him, of the thin line we were now balancing on. As the sky darkened, I turned on the lights and began preparing something for dinner. I chopped vegetables methodically, letting the rhythm distract me. The knife moved smoothly through the peppers and carrots, slicing the silence into manageable pieces. He came back down just as I was setting the table. His hair was damp from a shower, his shirt clean, the traces of the day washed away. He thanked me for dinner in a voice too formal, and I responded with a nod that felt like armor. We ate quietly. Again. It was becoming a pattern, our words held back, our movements deliberate. But underneath it all, something was alive. Something that had nothing to do with food or weather or repair projects. Afterward, we both cleared the table, moving around each other with a strange kind of grace, like we had choreographed this routine without speaking. "You want tea?" I asked. "Sure." I poured water into the kettle and stood with my back to him as it heated, feeling the tension stretch between us again. I could sense him behind me, not close, but not far either. "Do you regret it?" I asked without turning around. There was a long silence before he answered. "No." The word hit me harder than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I hadn't been able to say out loud. I turned then, slowly, and met his eyes. He didn't look away. "I don't know what to do with it," I admitted. "Me neither," he said. The kettle whistled, shrill and sudden. I turned away to silence it, pouring the hot water into 2 cups, hands trembling slightly. I handed him one. Our fingers didn't touch. We moved to the living room, each sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The television was off. The lamps glowed softly. The storm had finally arrived, rain tapping gently against the windows, steady and patient. For a while, we said nothing. Just sipped our tea, listening to the world blur outside. Eventually, he stood and said he was going to bed. I nodded. He hesitated before leaving, glancing back once. I didn't return the look. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what I would do if I did. I stayed there long after he was gone, the empty cup cooling in my hands. Upstairs, the house creaked softly, settling into night. I knew then that this wasn't over. That we hadn't just stumbled into something temporary. It was more complicated than that. More dangerous. And I wasn't sure who I was anymore, wife, woman, something in between. But I knew this, the part of me I had locked away for years had woken up. And it wasn't going to sleep again. The rain continued through the night, soft but insistent, like a presence that refused to be ignored. It tapped against the windows and rooftops with a rhythm that echoed something inside me, something slow, steady, and unresolved. I didn't sleep well. My body felt tired, but my mind wouldn't rest. I kept rolling onto my side, then back again, my eyes searching the ceiling as if answers might appear there if I looked long enough. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind that peculiar silence that only comes after hours of rain. The air felt thicker, weighted with moisture and something else, something I couldn't name. I got up earlier than usual, despite the broken sleep, and went straight to the kitchen, hoping the routine might stabilize me. He was already there. He sat at the table, a book open in front of him, but he wasn't reading. His eyes were distant, unfocused, and he didn't notice me right away. When he finally did, he straightened slightly and gave a nod, one of those gestures people use when words are too complicated. "Morning," I said, walking past him to the kettle. He echoed the word softly, but didn't add anything else. I could feel his eyes on me for a few seconds longer than necessary, and then they returned to the pages he hadn't turned. We didn't talk while the water boiled. We didn't need to. The silence between us had become a language of its own. I made tea for both of us, setting his cup down with a kind of automatic care. We each sipped quietly, eyes fixed on neutral points in the room, like two strangers waiting out a storm in the same shelter. But there was nothing neutral anymore, not really. At some point, I asked if he had any plans for the day. He said he was going to clean up the debris the storm had left in the yard. I nodded. The words felt like placeholders, space fillers, nothing more. Later that morning, I sat on the covered porch and watched him work. He moved efficiently, dragging fallen branches into neat piles, sweeping the wet patio stones with steady, focused strokes. It was strange, almost surreal, to watch him perform such ordinary tasks while the weight of what had passed between us hovered, invisible but heavy. From the outside, we must have looked like any two people going about their day. But inside, every glance, every motion, carried meaning. We were no longer who we had been. When he came up to the porch to rest, I offered him a glass of water. Our fingers brushed again, and this time neither of us pulled away too quickly. The pause was small, but it hummed beneath the surface like an electric current. He sat beside me, not too close, but closer than necessary. The quiet stretched between us again. I was the one who broke it. "I didn't sleep much," I said. "Me neither." I turned my head slightly, meeting his eyes. There was a shared understanding there, unspoken but clear. We both knew we were teetering. Not on the edge of something new, but on the collapse of something old. "I've never done anything like this before," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know." I looked down at my hands. "And yet, I don't feel like I'm being someone else. I feel more like myself than I have in years." He didn't respond at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." I nodded slowly. Maybe that's what made it harder, his refusal to demand anything, his lack of judgment. It gave me space I didn't know I needed. Space I hadn't had in a long time. We sat like that for a while, just breathing the same damp air, listening to the occasional drip of water from the eaves. At some point, he stood and said he'd be in the garage. I didn't ask what he'd be working on. It didn't matter. I stayed on the porch, staring out at the garden, where small puddles still reflected the sky. I thought about my husband, not in anger, not even in guilt, but in comparison. I thought about how long it had been since we'd had a real conversation. Not about bills or groceries or whose turn it was to pick up the dry cleaning, but about anything that mattered. I thought about how long I'd been pretending everything was fine. That evening, I made dinner again, roasted vegetables and rice. Simple, warm. Comfort food. He joined me at the table with that same quiet politeness, his presence both soothing and unnerving. We talked more this time, mostly about meaningless things. He told me a story about a friend from school who accidentally glued his fingers together during an art project. I laughed, genuinely, and he smiled in a way that reached his eyes this time. It felt good. Too good. After dinner, I did the dishes while he wiped down the counters. We worked in easy rhythm, our movements familiar by now. At one point, he handed me a towel and our hands touched again. It wasn't an accident. We both knew it. But neither of us said anything. When I finished, I leaned back against the sink and looked at him. He leaned on the opposite counter, facing me. The kitchen lights were soft, casting gentle shadows. I don't want to keep doing something that's going to hurt people, I said finally. I don't either, he replied. But I also don't want to pretend nothing is happening. His gaze didn't waver. Neither do I. I exhaled slowly. So where does that leave us? He looked away then, toward the window. The rain had started again, just a light drizzle this time, enough to blur the glass but not enough to drown out thought. I don't know, he said. But I'm not going to push you. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. I nodded, my throat tight. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a plan. But it was honest. And right now, that felt like the only thing we had. That night, I went to bed early. I lay in the dark, listening to the rain, my mind racing. There was no relief in the quiet. No certainty. Just a slow awareness settling into my bones, of who I was, what I wanted, and how far I had wandered from everything I once believed was unshakable. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel numb. I felt alive. Fractured, yes. But undeniably, painfully alive. The next day began with the smell of fresh rain still clinging to the air, as if the earth hadn't quite finished absorbing what had fallen overnight. Everything outside looked washed clean or brighter, somehow softer, yet inside me, the storm hadn't passed. If anything, it had gathered more weight in the quiet of my chest. I moved through the morning with deliberate slowness, tending to routine as if it might offer some kind of grounding. The kitchen was silent when I entered, but the evidence of his presence was there, a neatly washed coffee mug in the drying rack, the chair slightly pulled out, and a newspaper folded open to the weather section. He had left early again. Part of me was relieved. Part of me wasn't. I ate a quiet breakfast, then sat on the back porch for a while with my tea, the mug warming my hands more than the liquid warmed my throat. I watched the garden sway under a light breeze, leaves trembling, petals twitching. The plants didn't seem to mind what had passed. They just kept growing. It was nearly midday when I heard his voice behind me, casual and light, telling me the fence had dried enough to stain. I responded with a nod, and he got to work. The simplicity of it, the normalcy, was jarring. And yet I was grateful for it. Neither of us seemed to know how to be anything else, and that unspoken agreement brought with it a temporary kind of peace. For a while, I simply watched. His movements were focused, steady. He worked quietly, his face a mask of concentration. There was something admirable in it, the way he threw himself into the task without distraction. I envied him for it. I envied his ability to keep moving forward, while I felt caught in a loop, replaying moments in my mind that had no resolution. Later in the afternoon, I brought him a glass of water. He took it with a smile, the kind that felt practiced, polite. We stood in the sun for a moment, the space between us more visible than ever. It was strange, how even silence could change shape depending on what you'd been through. Thanks, he said, raising the glass slightly. I nodded. You've been working hard. He shrugged. It helps. I didn't ask what it helped with. I already knew. That evening, we didn't eat together. He mentioned wanting to finish the fence before dark, and I didn't argue. I cooked a simple meal for myself, then spent the rest of the evening in the living room, flipping through old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Most of the pictures were of family vacations, birthday dinners, holidays spent in the same living room I was sitting in now. I stared at the photos of myself, smiling, laughing, always just a few inches from my husband, always surrounded by people. But even in those frozen images, I could see the distance that had grown between us, the slow unraveling masked by traditions and camera flashes. At some point, I heard the back door open and close. I didn't look up. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway, the sound of water running in the bathroom, the muffled opening and closing of a drawer. The rhythm of it was familiar now, woven into the fabric of this new version of my life. He didn't come into the living room. And I didn't go to him. Instead, I sat there with the album on my lap, my fingers resting on a photograph of me and my husband from years ago, both of us younger, tanned from a trip to the coast, arms loosely wrapped around each other. I studied my own expression, wondering what that version of me would think of the woman I had become. Would she understand? Would she judge? Would she forgive? I closed the album gently and set it aside, then turned off the lights and made my way upstairs. The house felt heavier at night, not from fear, but from the sheer accumulation of moments, unspoken truths, glances held too long, words withheld out of caution. When I reached the bedroom, I stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. I didn't lock the door. I hadn't locked it in days. It was a small act of honesty, perhaps the only one I felt capable of. I changed slowly, folding my clothes neatly and placing them on the chair by the window. I pulled back the covers and sat on the edge of the bed, looking out into the darkness. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees outside, their branches casting moving shadows across the floor. I thought about the decisions we make without realizing their weight. How simple gestures can become irreversible. A conversation. A glance. A single step forward. I thought about the night we kissed. About the silence that followed. About how something so small had shifted everything. I lay down eventually, pulling the blanket up to my chest. My mind wandered without direction, moving through memories like rooms in a house I hadn't visited in years. Some doors I opened. Others I avoided. It was well past midnight when I heard the knock, soft, tentative, barely audible over the wind. I didn't speak. I didn't move. The door opened slowly, just a crack, and I saw his silhouette in the hallway light. He didn't step inside. He just stood there, uncertain. I met his eyes, and neither of us said a word. There was no question. There was no answer. Only choice. He stepped into the room, closing the door gently behind him. We spent the night together. The morning light broke through the blinds in thin, hesitant lines, dust particles floating lazily in its path. I opened my eyes slowly, already aware of the unfamiliar warmth beside me before I even turned my head. The silence in the room was thick, not uncomfortable, but loaded with everything we hadn't yet said. I didn't move right away. I stared at the ceiling, the same ceiling I had seen 1,000 times before, and yet that morning it seemed entirely different, less like a cover and more like a mirror. A witness to everything that had changed. Eventually, I sat up, pulling the blanket around myself, careful not to disturb the rhythm of his breathing. He hadn't stirred, or maybe he was just pretending to sleep. Either way, I didn't speak. There was no need. Not yet. I stood and made my way to the window, pushing the curtains aside with slow fingers. The yard was quiet, the fence now stained, the flower beds still damp from the night before. Nothing looked different. And yet, everything was. I heard him shift behind me, the soft rustle of sheets, a breath held and released. I should get dressed, I said, not turning around. There was a pause. Then a low voice behind me. Yeah. That was it. No apologies. No questions. Just acknowledgement. And strangely, that felt like enough. By the time I came back into the bedroom after changing, he was gone. The bed was neatly remade. His bag, which had been tucked quietly in the corner for days, was no longer there. I didn't know where he'd gone, and I didn't chase after him. Downstairs, the kitchen felt untouched. No fresh coffee, no sound of drawers or cupboard doors. I stood in the middle of the room, letting the stillness settle on my shoulders. I thought about the night before, not in flashes of guilt, but in long, steady thoughts. Thoughtful. Measured. I didn't regret it. I couldn't. Instead of sitting down, I walked out to the back patio. The morning air was cool, not cold. I could feel the sun pushing through the clouds, hesitant like someone approaching a room they weren't sure they were welcome in. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared out across the grass, my thoughts scattered but clear in their own strange way. It wasn't until I heard the sound of a car door closing that the fog of the moment started to lift. I turned slowly, instinctively, already knowing before I saw. The driveway. The familiar engine. The shape of him pulling a suitcase from the trunk. My husband was home. He hadn't called. No message. No warning. Just appeared like a question I hadn't prepared an answer for. I didn't panic. My heart didn't race the way I might have expected it to. Instead, I stood still, anchored to the ground by something far deeper than fear, consequence. He saw me, lifted a hand in a casual greeting, and smiled as if nothing had changed. As if I hadn't crossed a line I could never uncross just hours before. I walked to meet him, keeping my steps even, my face calm. My mind moved quickly, mentally folding up everything that had happened and tucking it away somewhere out of sight. "You're back early," I said, my voice even. He nodded, reaching for another bag. "The last day got cancelled. Thought I'd surprise you." I managed a smile. "You did." He kissed my cheek, familiar, mechanical, a gesture performed without thought. It landed lightly, almost apologetically. And I realized, in that moment, just how long I had been surviving on these hollow little rituals. Inside, he dropped his bags near the front door and stretched his arms, commenting on the smell of the house. "Clean," he said. "Like rain and lemon oil." "I thought I'd cook something later," I offered. "Simple." He agreed easily, already scrolling through his phone as he walked toward the living room. I followed him with my eyes but didn't join him. Instead, I returned to the kitchen and leaned against the counter, staring at the worn edge of the cutting board. My thoughts moved in silence, carefully, deliberately. I didn't feel caught. I didn't feel cornered. I felt split. When I heard footsteps on the back stairs, a different kind of tension gripped me. I didn't move at first. Just waited, listening. The sound stopped. Then I heard the familiar creak of the back door. A voice, his, called out something about heading into town for supplies. Neutral. Perfectly timed. My husband called back from the couch, something short and agreeable. I didn't hear the words. Only the way the air shifted when the door clicked shut again. For the rest of the afternoon, I moved through the house like a stranger. I washed dishes that were already clean. I dusted the hallway frames. I adjusted books that hadn't been touched in months. Anything to keep my hands busy while my mind hovered elsewhere. He sat in the living room watching television, commenting occasionally on the show or something he read on his phone. I nodded, smiled when required. On the surface, we were exactly what we had always been. But under that surface, something had shifted so profoundly that I no longer recognized the floor beneath my feet. When evening came, I cooked. Not because I wanted to, but because it was expected. A habit too old to break in one day. I chopped vegetables, seared chicken, stirred sauce. My hands moved out of memory, not desire. We ate together. He talked more than usual, perhaps relieved to be home. Perhaps unaware. I listened, asked a few polite questions, laughed where appropriate. He didn't notice the stiffness in my shoulders, the way I avoided eye contact. Or maybe he did and didn't want to ask why. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes. I let him. I sat at the table, staring at the remnants of the meal, trying to place myself back into the version of me that used to live in this role without question. But she didn't fit anymore. Not entirely. That night, when I went upstairs, I didn't wait for him. I changed into my night clothes, washed my face, and slid beneath the sheets without a word. He came to bed some time later, the mattress shifting under his weight. He turned off the lamp and lay back with a satisfied sigh, murmuring something about how good it felt to be home. I didn't respond. My eyes stayed open in the dark for a long time. Not because I was afraid he would find out, but because I no longer knew how to live in a house where nothing had been said, and yet everything had changed. The next morning began with the kind of artificial calm that feels almost suspicious. The house was quiet in a way that suggested nothing was wrong, nothing had changed, and yet I moved through it like someone holding their breath. My husband was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, already pouring coffee, already acting as though he had never left. He was humming quietly to himself, a habit he'd developed over the years when he was content or distracted. I watched him from the doorway for a moment, wondering how many times I had entered a room like this and never really seen him. He turned, smiled, lifted a second mug. "I figured you'd be up soon." I nodded and sat at the table, hands curled around the edge of my robe. I didn't mention the lack of sleep. He didn't ask. Instead, we settled into the same familiar rhythm, him speaking in scattered observations, me offering the occasional nod or wordless agreement. The difference was inside me now. Not in what I said or did, but in how I listened. Everything sounded louder. The scrape of the spoon against the bowl. The clink of his wedding ring on the mug. The way he cleared his throat before speaking. He asked about the garden, whether the rain had done any damage. I said no. He asked if I'd gotten the hinges on the back door fixed. I nodded. He didn't ask who had done it. The unspoken hovered between us, not in accusation but in absence. There were things he didn't know to ask, and things I no longer knew how to offer. Later that morning, he suggested we go out for lunch, just the two of us. "It's been a while," he said, reaching for his car keys. His tone was light, but I sensed the intention underneath. Reconnection. Reclaiming. I agreed without resistance. What else could I do? The drive into town felt strange, like slipping into clothes that didn't fit anymore. Everything looked the same, the gas station on the corner, the bakery with the faded awning, the row of maple trees beginning to turn, but I felt like an outsider. Not because of where we were, but because of who I had become inside it. We arrived at a small cafe we'd frequented in earlier years, before routines solidified into habit, before silence became our default setting. The hostess recognized us, seated us by the window. My husband ordered for both of us, something he used to do when we first married. I let him. As we waited for the food, he talked about his trip, about hotel breakfasts, conference panels, traffic in the city. I listened with half a smile, offering questions where expected. But my mind wasn't in the room. It was back at the house. In the hallway. At the foot of the stairs. Near the closed door that had hidden so much in so little time. When the food arrived, I picked at it politely. He commented on the seasoning. I nodded. At one point, he reached across the table and touched my hand, lightly, briefly. A gesture meant to close the distance. I didn't pull away. But I didn't return it either. On the drive home, he turned on the radio. Soft jazz filled the silence, the kind of station he liked to keep on in the background. I watched the trees blur past the window, wondering what he saw when he looked at me now. Did I seem different? Did he notice the way I held myself tighter, the way my voice dipped instead of rose? Back at the house, I excused myself to check the laundry. It wasn't a lie, there was a load still in the dryer, but it was mostly an excuse to be alone. In the laundry room, I stood with my hands pressed against the dryer door, eyes closed, breath shallow. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, listening to the slow spin of the drum, the soft thump of fabric turning over and over. It was soothing in a strange way. Predictable. Controlled. When I returned to the living room, he was dozing in the armchair, one leg stretched out, the newspaper resting open on his chest. I watched him for a long moment, something tightening in my chest. Not anger. Not resentment. Just a deep, low ache I didn't have words for. He looked peaceful. And in that moment, I wished I could feel the same. That evening, I prepared dinner again. The table was set for two, candles lit, as if habit alone could create meaning. He was cheerful, telling a story about someone from the conference, laughing at his own punchlines. I smiled, even laughed once, and the sound felt foreign in my mouth. Halfway through the meal, I heard the familiar creak of the back steps. My breath caught. I looked up instinctively, and he did too. A shadow moved past the window, just a flash, a presence. My husband frowned slightly. Is someone out there? I think he's just checking the gate, I said quickly, before I could stop myself. The lock's been sticking. He accepted the answer without suspicion. He always had. After dinner, he poured us both glasses of wine. We sat on the couch, side by side, our knees almost touching. He asked about the next few days, whether I had any errands, whether I wanted to go out again. I answered calmly, evenly. But my thoughts were fractured, scattered, unable to hold focus. Eventually, he leaned over and rested his head lightly on my shoulder. The gesture was sweet. Familiar. Once, it might have made me feel loved. Now it made me feel like an imposter. I let him stay there, still as stone, eyes fixed on the darkened window. Beyond the glass, I imagined the yard, the tools left by the fence, the footprints drying in the soil. I wondered if he was still nearby. If he was waiting for something. Or for nothing at all. That night, in bed, my husband reached for my hand under the covers. I let him take it. His fingers were warm, steady. His breathing soon slowed into sleep. I lay awake, my hand still in his, eyes wide in the dark. And I realized with slow, painful clarity, I wasn't afraid of being caught. I was afraid of how easy it had become to live with the lie. The days that followed unfolded with unnerving normalcy. My husband resumed his usual rhythms, as though his brief absence had been nothing more than a hiccup in our quiet life. He went for morning walks, trimmed the hedges, read the newspaper with his glasses sliding down his nose, and asked whether I'd remembered to water the hydrangeas near the fence. I had. I moved through those days like someone playing a role I had once mastered, but now barely remembered. The lines were still there, the choreography intact, but something fundamental had shifted in me. I was performing it all from memory, meals cooked at the right hour, shirts folded the way he preferred, my tone warm enough not to raise suspicion, but I wasn't inside the actions anymore. I was watching myself from a distance, and I wasn't sure I liked what I saw. The hardest part wasn't the guilt. It was how natural the lie had become. I had expected guilt to cling to me, to pull at my sleeves like a child desperate to be noticed. But instead, it had settled quietly, like dust in the corners of a room I no longer swept. And then there were the moments when our paths crossed, mine and his. He never stayed long now. He knew my husband was back, and with that knowledge came space. We passed like shadows, rarely speaking, barely looking, but always aware. Always aware. One afternoon, I found a note tucked under the edge of the kitchen towel by the sink. No name, no greeting, just a single sentence in his neat handwriting. Asterisk, I won't come unless you want me to. Asterisk, I folded it carefully and slid it into the back of a recipe book I hadn't used in years. That evening, my husband suggested we invite some neighbors over for drinks that weekend. I agreed automatically, already planning what glasses I'd use and which tablecloth might cover the small wine stain near the edge. That was how it worked now, one decision covering another, one task hiding what lay beneath. The day of the gathering, I woke up early and moved through the house like a woman possessed. I scrubbed counters that were already clean, rearranged cushions that no one would notice, ironed napkins as if smooth fabric could promise order. My husband left to buy wine and ice, and the house exhaled the moment the front door clicked shut. I stood in the hallway, hand still resting on the doorknob, listening to the sound of his car pulling away. The knock came exactly 3 minutes later. It wasn't loud. Just 2 soft raps that barely disturbed the air. I opened the door without checking the peephole. He stood there in the same gray t-shirt he wore the day I fell in the garden, as if time were folding in on itself. He didn't step inside. He didn't speak. I didn't either. We stood there, the threshold between us like a border neither of us dared cross. After a few seconds, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me something, a small, folded piece of paper. Then he turned and left. I closed the door slowly, my fingers pressing the paper so tightly they left faint creases in the corners. I didn't open it until I was upstairs, in the bathroom, door locked, the fan running to drown out everything else. Inside, in the same handwriting, asterisk, you don't owe me anything. I just needed to say goodbye. Asterisk. I sat on the closed toilet lid, the letter resting in my lap. I stared at the words until they blurred, not because of tears, but because of something far more quiet. Acceptance. A weight shifting. He was giving me an exit. Or maybe he was saving himself. Either way, it felt like a door closing, gently but finally. The neighbors arrived just after sunset. Laughter echoed through the house, glasses clinked, small talk floated like smoke in the air. My husband moved easily among the guests, smiling, pouring, nodding at the right moments. I watched him from across the room and wondered how long we'd both been pretending. At one point, he came up beside me with a plate of cheese and crackers. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his voice low but light. I smiled. "Just tired." He nodded, seemed satisfied with the answer, and returned to the conversation with a neighbor about the condition of the driveway. When the evening ended, and the last car drove away down the gravel path, I stood in the doorway and looked out into the dark. The air smelled of wine and citronella, damp grass and fading echoes. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just the final confirmation that the night was truly over. Upstairs, my husband was already brushing his teeth. I moved through my routine as if my body had memorized it independently of me, removing earrings, folding a cardigan, switching off the hallway light. In bed, he reached for my hand again, just like before. I let him take it, but this time, I turned my face toward the wall. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was ordinary. And that, somehow, made it worse. Because ordinary things, left unchecked, can become irreversible. Lying there, his hand warm in mine, I realized that endings don't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes, they come quietly, dressed as decisions made in silence. A letter tucked beneath a towel. A knock that goes unanswered. A choice never spoken, but lived. And in that quiet, I finally understood, I wasn't afraid of being found out. I was afraid that even if I confessed everything, no one would notice the difference. It had been 4 days since the letter. 4 days since the knock, the folded paper, and the quiet goodbye. 4 days of silence I hadn't tried to fill. I didn't look for him. I didn't ask where he had gone. I didn't tell my husband I had received anything at all. But that didn't mean I had stopped thinking about it. I went about each day with the same motions I had memorized years ago. I cooked, I cleaned, I answered the occasional text from a neighbor or friend. My husband had returned to his routines with seamless ease, watering the lawn, checking the mailbox, complaining about rising utility bills. The ordinariness of it all made me feel like a ghost, like I had stepped out of time and was now only pretending to belong. The note stayed tucked inside the back of the recipe book. I hadn't looked at it again. I didn't need to. Every word had etched itself into my mind. I could see the handwriting in my sleep. I could feel the shape of the paper between my fingers. He was gone. Not far, maybe, but gone. And for now, at least, that was the only certainty I had. One evening, after dinner, my husband sat on the couch with his laptop, muttering about insurance policies and outdated passwords. I sat in the armchair by the window, pretending to read a book. The words blurred on the page, and I found myself staring past them, past the edge of the lamp's glow, into the stretch of darkness just outside the glass. I wasn't waiting for anything. Not exactly. I was just still. It was around that time that something strange began to settle in me. Not panic. Not guilt. Something quieter. Resignation, maybe. Or recognition. Because for all the chaos I had allowed to stir inside me, for all the quiet betrayals and whispered choices, I had finally come to accept something I'd resisted for a long time: nothing was going to save me. Not a man. Not a mistake. Not even the truth. There wasn't going to be a reckoning. No slammed doors or weeping confessions. Just this, the quiet, heavy continuation of a life I had helped shape and now didn't know how to break apart without tearing down everything around it. Later that night, after the lights were off and the house had settled into its usual hush, I lay awake beside my husband and listened to the rhythm of his breathing. It was even and soft, just like every night before. Familiar. Predictable. And in that moment, I realized something else. He knew. Maybe not the details. Maybe not the who or the how or the when. But he knew something had changed. In me. In us. In the shape of our silences. And he had chosen not to ask. That, more than anything, broke something loose in me. Because I had spent so long fearing the truth would destroy us. But what I hadn't prepared for, what I hadn't even considered, was that indifference might be worse. The next morning, the sun came through the window in soft ribbons, landing across the floor like it always did. I got up, showered, dressed, made the bed. My husband had already gone downstairs by the time I reached the kitchen. The smell of toast and coffee lingered in the air. He looked up from the table and smiled. "Morning." "Morning," I replied. We sat together in silence, sipping from mismatched mugs. He asked about my plans for the day. I said I might do some gardening. He nodded. Then, out of nowhere, he set down his mug and looked at me, really looked. "Are you happy?" The question landed like a stone in the center of a still lake. I didn't speak right away. I didn't even move. He waited, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," I said finally. He nodded again. Okay. That was it. No demand for more. No pressing. No anger. Just acknowledgement. I stood up, placed my mug in the sink, and walked out to the back porch. The air was warmer than usual. A bird chirped in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked. I walked through the garden, my fingers grazing the tops of the lavender bushes. They had bloomed early this year. Or maybe I had simply never noticed before. By the time I reached the fence, my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear. From release. I stood there for a while, breathing in the scent of earth and wood, letting the sun hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like months, I allowed myself to feel nothing. Not sorrow. Not joy. Not shame. Just stillness. When I turned to go back inside, I paused at the threshold. The house stood quietly, unchanged, unmoved. But I had changed. I knew it now with certainty. Inside, my husband had returned to his laptop. Bills, perhaps. News. Something safe. He didn't ask where I'd gone. I didn't offer it. I sat down at the table across from him, opened my notebook, and began writing a grocery list. It felt like the right place to start. Because nothing was fixed. Nothing was healed. But something had ended. And endings, even quiet ones, make space for something else.